My name is Gilad Treiber. I'm an assistant professor here of political philosophy and ethics, and it's a pleasure to introduce for this upcoming session. We'll have two speakers, or two sets of one set of speakers, and then another one. So I'll present the other speakers who will be online later. But for now, we have the honor and pleasure to have Dr. Charlotte Blease, who is an health informaticist and associate professor at the Department of Women's and Children's Health at Uppsala University in Sweden, and a research affiliate at digital psychiatry at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston. She has many publications and is going to publish a book with the controversial name, Dr. Bot, Why Human Doctors Fail Us and How AI Can Save Lives, which will be published with Yale Press in 2025. Okay, great. So the floor is yours.
I'll stick to this controversial topic and not talk about AI today, but actually we could talk about AI. That might be interesting too. Yeah, so my background's actually philosophy of science. I started life in a philosophy department, but found myself, I migrated to psychology and found myself latterly in medical school. So my work is quite interdisciplinary. I've done a lot of health services research and kept my hand in with medical ethics, healthcare ethics very broadly. And do let me know at the back if I'm not loud enough. Is it okay? Speak more loudly. Okay.
There's also some seats here. There's still 3 seats that are highly free at the front, but then no one sits down.
Okay, so we'll begin. We've already heard from Vivian, and I should have said thank you for the invitation. Should have started by saying thank you for the invitation to Vivian and for organising this event, and also for organising it, I think, in a way that will become very relevant to my presentation. That is accommodating the voices of other people who can't be here, who are traditionally shut out from these kinds of conversations. We've heard about the prevalence of long COVID. So latest estimates are around 400 million people have experienced it worldwide. The economic cost, I think, is relevant here. Of course, the discussions, I'm not going to be talking about the socio-political context of long COVID, but it's certainly highly relevant to these discussions. So the estimated cost is $1 trillion annually. It's estimated about 7% of Americans have long COVID. That's a KFF health tracking survey. And in the UK, an estimated 1.8% of the population is believed to be affected. So a brief overview of today's very brief talk. I'm going to introduce the term energy limiting conditions. So we can think about long COVID as one of very many conditions, illnesses, diseases that are characterized by being energy limiting. I'll then move on to discuss epistemic injustice. I'll unpack those terms if you're not familiar with them, and then talk about, very briefly, but mention, of course, I'm not introducing this idea of epistemic injustice for no reason. So I'll talk about the evidence for epistemic injustice, particularly in relation to ME/CFS, but also long COVID. But I think really previous speakers have filled in a lot of that and presented some of the evidence for that anyway. And then I think it's easy to focus on what is wrong, the challenges, but I think it's important also to move to thinking constructively about what do we do next? How do we change things for people? And again, I'm only going to be very brief in some summation there, some reflections. So energy limiting conditions, I just sort of wanted to introduce the label. I've used it with some colleagues in a couple of publications recently, but it's the idea that there's some conditions that just generally shares their presentation, energy impairment of some sort. In relation to that, which, many primary care doctors would say, look, who isn't fatigued? That's one of the #1 complaints that they see among patients. So in part because of the vagueness of these kinds of presentations, among a variety of other reasons, patients do, with these sorts of conditions, experience a great deal of dismissal, disbelief, and so on. The actual concept of energy limiting conditions is only recent. It was coined in around 2020 by British researchers, disabled researchers. But as I said, it can be referred to, well, it's a sort of an umbrella term for a variety of different conditions. So musculoskeletal, neurological, autoimmune. ME would be one of them, long COVID, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. I have 2 siblings, including a twin sister with a form of muscular dystrophy that in its degenerative form certainly could be characterized as energy limiting as well. So all that in mind, moving on, epistemic injustice. So when we think about epistemology, for those not familiar with the term, we're thinking about knowledge. What is it we know? How do we know it? Knowledge formation. So it's a branch of philosophy dealing with knowledge. And philosophers, including Miranda Fricker, who was coined the term epistemic injustice, have said that epistemology or knowledge has an ethical, is entwined with ethics, meaning the branch of philosophy, what is the right thing to do, morality, ethics, and so on. So when we think about epistemic injustice here, we're thinking, look, knowledge, the sharing of knowledge, the production of knowledge, we're talking here in a university context, it's a valued good. So there's an ethical consequence to that, and it's something we value. But there can be inequalities in terms of access to knowledge, the production of knowledge, participation in knowledge formation activities, such as what we're doing today, sharing what we know, our expertise, our slant on things, asking questions. And the idea here is that the injustice can arise if there is inequalities in participation and accessing that knowledge, but also that there can be an ethical harm, if you like, to knowledge production, but also a literal harm as a result of that in some contexts, literally in healthcare, to patients. If knowledge is not advancing in the right direction or is not being subject to the right sorts of criticism or ideas. So Miranda Fricker talks about 2 kinds of discrimination that arise in relation to this idea of epistemic injustice. One is testimonial injustice, so testimony, just giving information to others. And she says that sometimes in this kind of injustice or discrimination can arise when people are unfairly discredited. So, for example, someone is talking and immediately you look at them, you sum them up, you size them up in terms of their appearance or some other factors associated with them. Could be, skin color, accent, long fingernails, whatever it might be, and you automatically have this sort of implicit judgment. Don't really think what they have to say is worth listening to. So it's a kind of preemptive strike against somebody when you're listening to them. You take them less seriously. And it can happen sort of unintentionally as well. What Fricker says is a speaker suffers testimonial injustice just if prejudice on the hearer's part causes him to give the speaker less credibility than he would otherwise have given. And it's characterized as a sort of insult. You're not listening, you're not paying due attention. And it can arise in healthcare, where it constrains the contribution of the patient. The patient might not be listened to. And of course, we go to doctors because they have expertise. It's important not to deny that as well. And we're also not saying that all ill persons have absolute expertise about everything associated with an illness either. We're not saying, I mean, my father suffered from dementia in his final years. A lot of what he said was not credible, but there's also times when patients can be reliable and they can be deep experts on their illness. Could be through traditional methods. They've researched it very heavily, and they might come with their own hinterland as well. But also because they're living with a condition 24/7, so they have intimate awareness of how it affects them and their functioning. and also of how health services are delivered and what they're experiencing there that is not observable from the other side of the stethoscope, so to speak. So we say that sort of these injustices arise with respect to epistemic privilege when an individual fails to fully appreciate the epistemic contributions of another person. So that they have something valuable to say, observations included. A second form of discrimination that Fricker talks about broadly is hermeneutical injustice. And here we're thinking about really the idea of making sense of your experiences. So it's, supposed to put it plainer, it would be like a bit like trying to tell a story about your experiences, but you lack the words to communicate it, and the listener doesn't also have the words to fill in the gaps and to make sense of it. So what she argues here is that there can be deficits, structural deficits, when it comes to creation of knowledge and access to epistemic resources, knowledge formation activities. Hopefully this will become clearer. But when she says here that there can be a collective gap in understanding that really makes it hard for people to communicate their experiences or to make sense of them, and both the speaker and hearer are labouring under the same inadequate tools. But certain structures and practices, including in the academy and healthcare and elsewhere, can lead to serve to diminish understanding. That is, really hurt our ability to generate knowledge effectively and to advance and progress in a particular domain. Ian Kidd and Javi Carrel are two philosophers of medicine who've sort of advanced what Miranda Fricker talks about in terms of epistemic injustice. And they say that there are two kinds of strategies. But the term strategy, I prefer to say, sort of processes in a sense, or tendencies that can arise that can lead to a kind of undermining of this hermeneutical injustice. I don't love the term hermeneutical, I will say, but anyway, that's another story. But what they talk about is strategies or processes of exclusion. So what we're thinking about here is people can be excluded from contributing to knowledge, from engaging with knowledge creation processes. They can actually be excluded physically. So it takes more than just ramps sometimes to get people inside a building and give them access to resources, but it can also include sort of subtler forms of exclusion. So it could be almost somewhat ironic in terms of what we're doing now, but it could be this sort of strenuous insistence on certain kinds of impenetrable esoteric terminology, maybe like epistemic injustice or hermeneutical injustice. But the point is, certain people can be excluded. In fact, it's very relevant in interdisciplinary settings as well in universities, because if people are talking in their own language and failing to try to make what they research accessible to their peers, even in a university, that leads to problems, miscommunication, and failures of opportunities for criticism and so on too. So that is one way in which people can be excluded. Another way that they can be excluded is through forms of expression. So you lack the kind of lingo, you might not be familiar with the social norms associated with particular practices. And it could be that in an effort to make yourself understood, you engage in forms of expression that are even more alienating. So it could be you become more frustrated, nobody's listening, you become somewhat annoyed. And this in turn can be further used against you, in a sense, sort of an invitation for gaslighting, like, well, this is further evidence that you are not rational, you don't really deserve a place at the table, and leading to further sort of disenfranchisement. So it's sort of entwined with that idea of testimonial injustice. You don't want to listen to what the person is saying, and you devalue them. So thinking about this particular framework, it's interesting, and one of the things I've done was to apply it to ME, and so chronic fatigue syndrome. So the idea that, in fact, a lot of patient groups may suffer from this tendency to be excluded or from epistemic injustice when they have deep insights about their condition. Certainly what we found, and I wrote with people, Keith Garrity, notably, who lives with ME, who's actually a medical student, and he had to drop out of his studies because of ME, and was referred to psychiatrists who told him he was a perfectionist. But the idea, when you actually look at the literature, there's quite a body of literature here in terms of both quantitative but also qualitative research, which is very important in this domain, to listen to what people are experiencing and to quantify it in some sense too, the kinds of experiences they're having. But people with ME are frequently discredited or treated with prejudice. That's not to say, so we've got the survey evidence from patients. We also have evidence from healthcare providers, clinicians, and students. But it's not to say that this is sort of all medical. The whole of medicine has been, there in these surveys you see many doctors really want to do what they can for these patients, but unfortunately not all. And there is a tendency to stereotype and disbelieve. And certainly we've seen that the condition has been psychologized, where patients are perhaps not overtly told it, but they read between the lines. They're being told this is all in your head. You've abnormal beliefs, illness beliefs that you're unintentionally perpetuating, a sort of a desire to be sick. And that in turn has led to deep frustration and anger among patients, who in turn have been labelled militant. There's a great deal of rhetorical hyperbole in these debates from one side, and in fact picked up as well by the British press. And we saw some this morning as well, some of the evidence from in Germany and in Britain. Certainly there were newspapers, leading broadsheet newspapers, discussing this idea of militancy. And patients' testimonies or words tended to be dismissed, so they weren't getting a fair hearing in relation to what they understood about their own condition. So long COVID, is it history repeating? There's people in this room much better equipped who've spoken this morning about that. We've just heard from the previous speaker as well. Joanne Hunt is somebody who lives with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and also with ME, and we decided to write a paper sort of 2021. It was probably around 2020 we started to write this or think about it, but we were comparing, we sort of said, long COVID's at a crossroads here. We can either learn from history and see, is this going to be the same route that the patients with ME had experienced or not? And certainly, it's very hard to have a discussion about long COVID without talking about ME, not least because of the overlap in symptoms. So I believe there's a certain clustering that makes them distinct, but there's certainly a lot of overlap. There's the idea that they share post-viral origins. The threat of historical stigma was sort of looming when we wrote this. Is it going to happen, or was there a tipping point because so many people were experiencing long COVID, including health professionals? And we did see sort of inklings that there was, going to be more research, policy attention, sort of this glimpse of possibly this could be a turning point. But we also mentioned in that particular article, there's real risks here for dismissal. And I think the speakers have said this morning, they've done the job for me, for psychologization, discrimination, and unfortunately just further discrediting a kind of aversion to thinking about even considering these illnesses. So we do see, and I've only plucked a couple, there's not the same level of survey research, and I'm glad that, I'm horrible with the names, anyway, the team from Leipzig University who have done this research on psychologization and stigma around long COVID, because there's not that much published research on it, and I'm sure that's going to change. Unfortunately, I suspect that the results are going to be disheartening, but from one study that found that 95% of respondents with long COVID said they did experience stigma related to their condition. 60% felt compelled to be cautious with whom they disclosed their illness too, and a third regretted saying anything about it. Other studies, a British study found that patients who were already disadvantaged in some sense, so people with low incomes, ethnic minorities, felt even more stigmatized, which again could widen health inequalities. We saw initially as well that certainly in some contexts there's been some progress, comparative progress. I want to say it's not the benchmark of ME is a very low benchmark, but it's important to point out that guidelines in the UK, for example, so theoretically anyway, the NICE guidelines changed largely as a result of patient researchers and the work that they did to criticise the PACE clinical trial, which was riddled with problems, which advocated graded exercise therapy and cognitive behavioural therapy as frontline treatments for ME. But it was largely as a result of patient researchers, hence the emphasis on epistemic injustice. But they learned the language of science and published in top journals. It became very increasingly difficult to ignore them. But that was rolled back in 2021. However, other countries have learned about what's happened in the Netherlands today, but in Sweden, this siloed appreciation for research, and the National Board of Health and Welfare in Sweden issued guidelines for long COVID that included graded exercise therapy, putting patients at risk, which just is unfortunate to say the very least. But I want to move on to say something else. So we're talking about people being excluded from arenas where they could contribute to knowledge and so on. And I also kind of wanted to turn the camera towards universities too, and what we might be able to do as well ourselves. And I think this is something I wrote about with Joe Hunt. And we wrote a more accessible article in terms of what we meant. But this is also why I think what Vivian has put together is really, unfortunately, it's exceptional, but it's a very good thing that we have so many people potentially listening, watching this from their houses, from their beds as well, where they're at least possibly, and I can't speak for them obviously, and I hope there'll be more comments and contributions, but where it's very important to hear those voices and to create more visibility in inverted commas. So what we noticed, Joe and I noticed, was there's so very many recent years, people are talking a lot about diversity, equity, inclusion, and all the rest of it. And in respect of those policies where very well motivated, that people should feel included in different fields and not feel like outsiders, that sort of that they can contribute and be a part of, or aspire to be a part of different research traditions in universities. When I was young, medicine was considered, 47, medicine was considered largely male dominated. In fact, where I was growing up in Northern Ireland, that's changed a lot, which is a good thing. But what we looked at, so where we talk about a kind of leaky pipeline in academia, there has been a focus on ethnicity, income, gender, with all for very good reasons. But what we notice is there really doesn't seem to be much discussion about people with disabilities. And where we noticed that you can talk about a kind of leaky pipeline here, there didn't seem to be much of a pipeline at all. So people aren't just sort of marginalised from the academy, they may be outright excluded. And of course, it's important to be nuanced about these things too, to say not everybody can do every kind of, or contribute to every kind of academic discipline for a variety of reasons, some very good reasons, but not all. For example, when it comes to physical disability, it's not about demanding everybody has a space at a lab bench, for example, but it's about accommodating people within research context who could be there, could be contributing, and recognizing that sometimes we should be doing more to include people who do not feel welcome. So there is a great deal of evidence of exclusion when it comes to people with disabilities, not just within the academy, not just physical and attitudinal barriers to participation in research, but we do see that when it comes to undergraduate courses and then the transition to postgraduate work, we really see a dropping off where there is any kind of quantification of people with disability. And that can directly affect research. It can, Vivian, there's no accident why Vivian's interested in long COVID. People tend to research what really turns them on, what they're interested in. They have a perspective on, an acuity of understanding about. And part of that can be driven by living with the experience of an illness. So excluding people, particularly in healthcare research, is probably a real mistake if we only care about the quality of research. So as I say, it's not just a case of making it accessible physically, that's important, but it's about creating other kinds of accommodations that can include people. And I wanted to sort of include what Joanne experienced too, because this may otherwise sound a little bit airy-fairy. So Joanne Hunt, for many years, she's very prolific, and she's largely housebound and bedbound with her conditions. But she's published a number of articles, and she's published about a dozen articles actually, but still has struggled to be enrolled in a PhD program in university. And she sort of has the email receipts from a lot of top institutions in the UK where she wanted to be enrolled and was told that it wasn't possible. Remote learning wasn't possible. And really, as many of us know, for a lot of the research that we do, we just need online record access, online library access, a laptop. Most of us don't want to socialize anyway, but it's sort of conducive to the fact. But so she was excluded in ways that were told that just didn't make sense. So, for example, some courses said that they permitted postgraduates to be remotely enrolled, others didn't. So there does seem to be a fragmentation, a lack of appreciation for the fact that this is excluding people in ways that are very damaging. As I say, if only we cared about the research alone, and including for funding barriers as well, actually. So we don't tend to see funding earmarked for people with disabilities, which is really an oversight. So what do we do about all of this? Look, this is a really very brief. One of the things certainly has to be a greater clinician literacy when it comes to, I think in particular, I've said energy limiting conditions, but medically unexplained symptoms. Just because we don't have biological markers, although there is increasingly good biomedical research on post-viral conditions, is important not to be ignored. But we do need to create more humility, I think, where we don't have those markers does not mean there'll be a logical fallacy to assume the thing doesn't exist. So if it's not in the doctor's head doesn't mean it's all in the patient's head. And we also need to think about research context. What can we be doing to harness the knowledge, the expertise of people who have illnesses, conditions that they live with? What can we do to include them? How can we improve disability and equality training even in our own institutions? And what maybe can we be doing to formalise that, to make sure that we're being held accountable in terms of formal monitoring or transparency in relation to including those voices? And I had to finish with a plug for my book. Forgive the, we'll linger there for a while until thank you for listening.